All right, so we talked about the Roaring Twenties, but let's talk about what happened fairly soon after that period of time was over. And let's talk about the Great Depression and the stock market crash. Okay, so we had just talked about how in the 1920s everybody was starting to um, have more free time. They were wanting to do nice kind of extra things for themselves. We had this whole boom of the automobile business and all of the things that affected. But then during that boom in the 1920s, many people hoped to grow their wealth by speculating in the stock exchange, a market for shares of company. If a company does well, the value of the stock increases and the owner can then sell the stock for a profit, right? But what happens? Okay, so that's here. If a company does well, quote unquote, I'm going to underline there, then the value of the stock increases. Okay, and it goes up like this. But what happens if the company does not go well? Well, then you have this line that was drawn in the book. Company does not go well, it goes down, and instead of being able to sell the shares of the company for more than what you paid, you may not even be able to get what you paid back out of that. You may actually lose money. So we have people who were thinking they were so I guess the word I'm looking for is like they were so secure, things were so prosperous, nothing bad could happen. So they decided to take this risk, and then here's where we are. Okay? During the bull market of the 1920s, people bought stocks eagerly. Okay? They were ready. They just knew that everything was going to come out all right. Again, like I said, the economy was turning around. Things were prosperous. They had no reason to think that anything bad was coming or that anything negative could happen. But alas, this is not entirely the case. Oh, my picture's not adjusted right. Yes, so when you have a bull market, when you have a kind of a booming, bustling, really a market that's really thriving, then it was easy to convince people to buy in. It was easy to convince people that this could be a good idea, and that sure, it was a risk, but maybe it was a risk worth taking. Maybe it wasn't so much of a risk or so dangerous. But then the other side of that is the bear market. And I'm not sure if you can see during that. Yeah, you can see it. It's in kind of a pink sort of a outfit. It's like a curly Q sort of thing. I'm not entirely sure what it is. It's not the gemstones from the other day. Let me see if I can adjust that down. Okay, awesome. And yeah, so then when you have a bear market, then prices are falling, it's not doing so well, and it's, a lot of people try to sell their stock before things ever get to that point. So, bull market, values are increasing, even though the companies themselves weren't worth any more than they had been, but the economic boom was just absolutely huge, and so it was giving people this hope that things would continue in the same exact way, and they had no reason to think otherwise. Some people bought stocks using borrowed money, though, which they hoped to pay back with the profit from their stock. So that's almost a double risk at this point, because you're not even at that point using your own money. You're using a loan from a bank, or worse, from like family members or something, somebody personally you know. And so if you're counting on those stocks being able to pay you back and then some, pay you back plus some profit, but then suddenly the bottom falls out of the stock market, then you are just up a creek. There's no way that you're going to be able to come back from that and meet those obligations that you made when you borrowed the money. People were also, quote, buying on margin, which meant they only paid 10% of the stock price initially. So they hoped the price would rise quickly so they could resell for a profit before they actually had to pay the entire price of the stocks, right? Again, so it's not exactly borrowed money, but it's a very similar idea. In the middle of 1929, let me see if I can get this to underline, since it's not, maybe. Let's see. It's not feeling super cooperative. Let's see if I can do this. In the middle of 1929, the value of stocks reached a high point, and some people decided to sell their shares. Okay? They were like, hey, look, we've actually made some money. Let's go ahead and sell and get out of the market. But the more people sold, the fewer people wanted to buy. So then that decreases the value of the stocks. On October 29th, 1929, a day known as Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed to almost zero value. Many people lost all their money in a single day. All right, so Black Tuesday here, referring to it was a dark day. It was a black day, okay, because it was such a bad day for so many people. All right, we just talked about bull and bear. So then here's my little picture of a bull saying buy, and here's my little picture of a bear saying sell. So now here we are, the Great Depression. Black Tuesday was the beginning of the Great Depression, the worst economic crisis in American history. Many people had bought stocks on the easy credit of the 1920s. Again, borrowed money, okay? Credit lines right there, borrowed money. But when they defaulted on their loans, default here means to fail to pay a debt. I'm not sure if you can see this very well. This picture is kind of dark on my end, but to fail to pay a debt. So I don't know if you guys have ever heard about anything being repossessed. People sometimes have cars or other equipments repossessed, or a home foreclosed on if they're no longer able to make the payments. Now, granted, that's a fairly it doesn't happen immediately. Like if you miss one payment, it's a fairly drastic sort of response. But this is what we're talking about. They had these things that they were paying for on credit, installment plans, such and so forth, and they were no longer able to make the payments. And so when they defaulted on their loans, then who else is losing money? Not only did the individuals not get the money out of the stock market that they had hoped, but also now banks and stockbrokers and whatever whomever else had been involved in the process, they're not getting paid for their services either. Okay, so now we have this ripple effect where now we have this ripple effect, but it's of bad things. Okay, it's that okay, I'm not getting paid, and then like I was expecting to, so then you don't get paid like you were expecting to be because I physically don't have the money to pay you, and then you can't pay what you need to pay because I didn't pay you, so you can't pay the next person, and all this kind of stuff. Okay, so this is a very negative ripple effect that we're dealing with. Okay, the stock market crash, though, as big and bad as it was only a small part of the cause of the Great Depression. So let's talk about this big arrow here that we have. The illusion of wealth that swept the country in the previous decade had led to overproduction in factories and agriculture. Okay, so here, let me see again. Come on, pen, cooperate. The illusion of wealth here. I'm going to draw a little arrow to it. Illusion of wealth actually had people thinking that we were closer to being okay than we really, really were. So when people start going out and spending all this money and, you only live once, let's do this, let's throw parties, blah, blah. They were like, oh, we're going to be so great. Factories and farms, they were like, hey, we can produce however much we want and we'll get paid for it, because things are looking up. But in reality, few people could afford to purchase the goods produced. So the surplus, the excess, the extra that was left over caused prices to fall because they were trying to now get rid of the extra that they had been able to produce. And then when the prices fall, then the profits fall, right? Because you're having to, when you reduce your price, you're having to actually reduce the profit that you would be making off of these sales as well. That's just how this works. And then when profits fell, that led companies to lay off their workers, right? Because if I can't sell it for a high enough price to make the same profit, I don't have that same amount of money coming in. Well, then I'm definitely not going to have enough money to support payroll going out. So, then people start losing jobs if they don't have the ability to support payroll. Due to high unemployment, even fewer people could afford the goods. Okay, again, if you're not working, you're not making money. If you're not making money, you can't spend money. And if you can't spend money, then the companies aren't making as much money. If the companies aren't making as much money, they can't pay as much money. Jobs are lost again. And again, we have this cycle. All right. And this cycle here we're referring to as a snowball. Okay. So we have this cycle where things are going round and round and round. But let me see if I can circle this. Snowball. Okay. I don't know if you guys have ever seen an old cartoon where somebody starts falling down a hill, a snowy hill, and eventually eventually snow will start accumulating on them and it'll get bigger and then bigger and then bigger. And then eventually they're this giant snow boulder rolling down the cliff. Or maybe they turn into a snowman. Well, this is the kind of thing that we are talking about here. Snowball, to grow or become larger or more intense at an accelerating rate. Okay? So these negative effects, these repercussions of the Great Depression were becoming more and more intense, larger and larger ripple effects at an accelerating rate. Okay? Like these cartoon characters rolling downhill. Okay, so that's bad enough. We have talked about this sort of stuff before. Okay? So this right here is economic stress, right? The flow of money is under a lot of stress at this point because there's not as much of it going around. So let's talk about something that's a little bit different from this time as well. Anyone who deposited money into a bank account lost it if the bank went out of business. Let me underline all of that, okay? Because these are no longer the days where people just hung on to their cash. They were investing, right? There were interest rates and things. There were loans. There were credit lines. So people are using banks, but a bank is ultimately a business just like anything else. So if it gets hit by the Great Depression and goes out of business, there's no way for you to get your money, your investment, back out of that bank. So people started to panic. When people with savings in banks saw that loans were being defaulted on, they panicked and withdrew as much money as possible. Okay? So we finally had gotten away from people who just stored their life savings in a shoebox under the bed or sewed it into mattresses or pillows to try and hide it. All of these methods where people used to try and hang on to physical cash money on their person and keep it safe. We had finally gotten away from some of those habits using the banks, and now people have gone straight back. So as soon as they started hearing that they may not be able to have access to their money, lots of people started storming the banks trying to get their money out. Now, when you do that, when you put when you cause a run on the bank, when you physically take all of the cash out, then the bank definitely goes out of business, right? That makes sense. If they don't have any money with which to actually do banking transactions, they're not going to be able to stay open. So this was sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, so people were worried that the banks were going to close, so they went and they withdrew all of their money before the banks closed, which in turn, doing that, made the banks close, which created more panic, which made people go to other banks and withdraw their money, which made more banks close. Okay, so we've got another negative cycle here. And this put more banks out of business, making it impossible for other businesses to take out loans. Layoffs followed, and this process snowballed too. Okay? So here, instead of calling this one economic stress, we're going to call this banking stress, okay? Because this specifically affected lending and borrowing money and depositing into savings accounts and things like that. So this is banking stress. This is a banking specific problem, not just the economy in general, even though these two things are very, very much connected. Banks and the economy are very much connected. All right, and then this third thing, tough economic times in other countries reduced the market for exports. So here we have trade stress, okay? If they're reducing the market for exports, as in not being able to send as much over, and certainly not being able to buy as much from us, because remember, we were doing a lot of this trade business with Europe, who is in the process of recovering from the terrible mess still that was World War I. They're not able to trade with us in the exact same way, and we're certainly not able to trade with them in the exact same way. So now we have trade stress going on as well, as far as buying and selling of goods to other countries. All of these things are piling into that comical little snowball of the cartoon character running down the hill, or rolling down the hill. Okay, so at the start of the Great Depression, our president was Herbert Hoover. Okay, he started after the election of 1928. See if I can get that to underline. Yeah. The Republican Party was credited with the perceived prosperity of the time. Okay, so right before the stock market crashed, there was this idea that the Republican Party were the ones mainly responsible for the prosperity, for all of the economic recovery and stuff like that. So when Hoover runs in 1928 as a Republican, they were basically like, yeah, we want this guy, more prosperity, okay? More of the same, please and thank you, okay? Hoover was a strong believer in laissez-faire economics and small government, okay? And when the crash happened, when the Depression started spiraling out of control, his stance was, hey, it's not the job of the federal government to take care of the people, because we're looking again for small government, limited government interaction at this point. Instead, the crisis should just sort itself out. Okay, it's a normal cycle of the economy to have better times and worse times, which that part is legitimately true. And so if we just leave the economy to itself, it will eventually get right side up again, basically. If we just leave it to its own devices, it will actually sort itself back out, and then maybe we can get back to normal. Now, the problem with this is that this was not simply a time where things were inconvenient. It's not like, oh, I can't get my favorite tea because it's not being shipped from overseas anymore, or man, I can't get the latest fashions that I want because this one store closed down. Okay, we're not talking inconvenient things happening. We're talking about, like it says in this next paragraph, we're talking about high unemployment. Okay, people making $0 with no prospect of being able to change that at any point in the near future. We're talking about literal hunger, not I'm kind of hungry, maybe I should cook a pizza. We're talking about actual starvation starting to set in. We're talking about here homelessness. Okay, this is starting to happen across the country. As people were defaulting on loans, they're losing even the few resources that they had. They're losing access to acquire food. They're losing the roofs over their heads if they were bought on credit, or if they depended on credit to get by from day to day. We're talking people in very, very serious bad situations. This little arrow right here, I'm going to call attention to it right here. 29% of Americans, 12 million people, were unemployed. Okay? That is a lot. 29% unemployment. That is a very high number. Okay? Children left school to work or ran away because they felt they were a burden on their parents. Do you guys remember? I'm going to put a bracket right here. Do you guys remember when children were made to work during the Industrial Revolution? Question mark. Do you guys remember when we talked about, hey, in order to make ends meet, it was not uncommon for children who had been through a little bit of school, they would go to a certain age or until their family just couldn't take it anymore, and then they would be sent off to the factories and stuff like that. We talked about it when we read The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. So this here is happening again. They left school to go to work, or they just ran away trying to make it on their own because they felt like they were too much of a burden on their parents or on their families. They thought, look, I see, maybe they had siblings. I see mom and dad, they're struggling to make ends meet. Maybe if I strike out on my own and they just feed, my younger sibling, maybe that'll be easier on them. This is terrible. This is a terrible situation to be in. Families fell apart. Let me get this underlined for you. Families fell apart, okay? Even when the nation pleaded with the government to act, even when they said, look, this is not a normal cycle of government. This is a much bigger deal than that. We need some sort of intervention. Hoover refused, okay? He said absolutely not, because he believed, again, in small government. As hands-off as was really feasible, okay? Which, this did not appear feasible, but at least for him, he felt that this was, again, something that would eventually ride himself. So these shanty towns kind of spring up, okay? Shanty town here, I'm going to circle it. A neighborhood of informal houses, usually made from discarded materials. So I don't know if you guys have ever heard the term tent city. Tent city. This a lot of times can be referring to nowadays where a group of homeless people will congregate and kind of camp together. If they can find a discarded tent, or if they can make some sort of shelter out of things that they can find, it's not uncommon for them to come together and make a little community. Well, these communities at this point were called shanty towns, okay? So we're talking about maybe scraps of plywood leaned together. We're talking about no flooring to speak of, just on the dirt, but you at least had a roof and some walls Your roof might even just have been like plastic sheeting or a tarp. And so this is how people are living now because of the unemployment, the hunger, the homelessness, children running away trying to live on their own so they don't burden their parents or their families. We have all these people displaced and all of these people who have no hope of in their who had no hope in their current situation and are just desperate to get somewhere to where maybe there's an opportunity, maybe there's a job, maybe if they can get to a different town, maybe there's a job, maybe someone is looking to hire for labor, maybe they could lie about their age if they're children, to get work in a factory somewhere, if there was anywhere at all that had an opening. I think you'll remember that from the jungle as well, that they were fudging ages to try and make the children of that family old enough to qualify to work. Okay, so these shanty towns that sprang up to house people evicted from their homes, as well as runaways and things like that, became known as Hoovervilles. Now, would you like to be attached to a shanty town forever? Your last name be synonymous with people in these terrible, desperate living conditions? I would not find that very flattering. I would want to not be associated with that. But nonetheless, they asked him for help, and he did not help. And now his name is forever associated with these sorts of living conditions. Eventually, Hoover gave in. But look here. 1931. Okay? Years later, eventually he gave in. The Hoovervilles was already done and stuck at this point. In 1931, he authorized spending on public works, like the Boulder Dam, which is now called the Hoover Dam, after him, to create jobs. So, okay, this is a public works project. The government can fund this project, and it will create jobs, and it will maybe help increase the quality of life for people who have previously been unemployed, starving, and or homeless. In 1932, the next year, he agreed to the creation of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which made loans to banks and businesses. Okay, so the idea, again, reconstruction, putting back together, the idea being that he gave authorization to form this with the intent of being able to rebuild some of the economy. Again, he's trying to do it in a very hands-off way, which I understand personally, but it was very disappointing to many, many, many folks who actually lived through this time. He was not remembered especially fondly for his response. The bonus army. Hoover's reputation was damaged even further, when in the summer of 1932, see if I can underline that. Oh, almost got it. I missed. 1932. That was closer. Okay. World War I veterans who were due to receive bonus pay in 1945 marched on Washington to demand early payment. Again, these veterans are the same as everybody else in that they're also dealing with unemployment and potentially hunger or homelessness. Oh my goodness, what did I just do? I just erased part of my page. Okay, not doing that again. All right, so they're also dealing with these sorts of struggles, right? They're not immune to these economic difficulties. So they march and they say, look, you owe us money, legitimately owe us money. We're supposed to get a bonus in 1945. We clearly need it now. The world is struggling, so we're going to march and we're going to make ourselves heard, and, you're going to have to deal with us, basically. All right, so they're demanding early payment at this point. And Hoover and Congress still, they're faced with all of these veterans, and they refused. Okay? So when they did that, which I think this is interesting, some of the protesters stayed in a D.C. area, Hooverville. So they had marched on Washington, they had marched on D.C. to try and make their point, and when they were refused, when at first the administration didn't listen, they decided to actually get kind of settle down for a bit in a D.C. area, Hooverville, and under, I think, okay, so I think the idea here was that they were going to find these people who felt similarly about President Hoover and his lack of action and whatnot, and they were going to recruit them for an even bigger demonstration. I think that was the concern. So when this started happening, Hoover directed General Douglas MacArthur. Let me see if I can underline that. Oh, that was pretty good. He was actually directing General MacArthur to take the military to drive out the quote-unquote bonus army, as in the army that was here to claim the bonus, using tanks and tear gas. Okay? Tanks and tear gas. He did not go and calmly ask them to leave and disperse. He went in, loaded for bear, tanks and tear gas, and then here, sad face, several Great War veterans, several World War I veterans who just wanted their agreed upon bonus pay were killed in this reaction, and the public was shocked. Okay, because again, they came, they marched. This is stuff that is protected as a general rule in the Constitution. They go to stay in a Hooverville, and because they potentially might have had some sort of plan to incite a more aggressive response, they are reacted to with tanks and tear gas before they even have a chance to do anything. And several of the veterans ended up being killed. When they didn't actually go through with any sort of like terrorist act or anything like that. It's just terrible. Absolutely terrible. Hoover ran for president again in 1932, which I think was tremendously brave of him, considering everything that had gone on and just how unpopular he was. But he knew that his chances of winning were slim. So he ran as a Republican, and then his Democratic rival was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR. Okay? He ended up being, well, we'll get there in a second. So he ran as the Democratic nominee, and he had a little bit of extra oomph because of that last name, Roosevelt. He is a cousin. He was a distant cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, and he actually was paralyzed from the waist down from polio. Polio was an absolutely terrible disease that thankfully is largely eradicated now due to vaccinations and better therapies, better medications. But yeah, he was paralyzed from the waist down. And if you read about FDR, I'm going to rewrite that up here a little bigger. If you read about him, you'll see that he had a special desk commissioned for his time in the White House where he could hide the wheelchair and not appear, have it not appear that the President of the United States, that was one of the larger global powers, was weak or injured and stuff like that. He was very, very cognizant of his appearance, and that he did not want to be seen as a as a weak or crippled leader. He wanted to be recognized for his policies, and for his decisions. Roosevelt had an excellent record of helping the people of New York, where he was governor, and a strong group of advisors known as the Brain Trust helped him with policy. So his campaign promised a new deal for Americans, and he won the election easily. Not only did he come in saying, hey, I have a plan, I have this new deal, but also at this point, Hoover was pretty much seen as the worst. So he was able to just come in and kind of sweep up the presidency really, really easily. I don't know if you can see this, but down here in this bottom corner, we have two little brains. What do you think? I trust you. What do you think? And so two little brains talking. So this is what he was talking about. His advisors, the Brain Trust, okay? He was not trying to do all of this on his own. He was not trying to relate to everybody and solve all of the problems and manage all the diplomacy and everything. He was not trying to do this on his own. He had trusted advisors, and he really took advantage of their wisdom. He let them, he let them advise him, which I think, honestly, is just good advice. If you've got somebody that you can trust, somebody that's very wise, I think it's always good to, to hear another opinion whenever you're making big decisions. So let's talk about his New Deal, his first New Deal that he came into office with. In his first inaugural address, FDR famously told the nation that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Okay, so here, I'm going to see if I can write a little star by it. All right. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Okay, remember, he's talking to people who are massively stressed out. He's talking to people who are anxious about the economy and about their own personal odds of survival, hungry people, homeless people, people still looking for jobs. So he's trying to calm down all of these anxieties. He quickly set out to destroy that fear. Roosevelt became president on March 4th, 1933. Let's see if I can underline that. Ha! And he called a special session of Congress that is known as the 100 Days. Okay? Within this 100 days, he just hit the ground running and started making some changes and really instituting some long-term sort of changes that he believed would help. So let's talk about those. He instituted a bank holiday, closing all the banks in the nation for a few days while the Emergency Banking Relief Act was passed, and only reopened the ones that were stable. Okay, so here's one thing. I'm going to put a dot right here. Little line. Here we go. Bank holiday. So he's trying really hard to get the banks back on their feet. He's only reopening the ones that are stable. He's not putting any of them that were kind of teetering on the edge. He's not putting them back in harm's way. He is doing his best to kind of minimize the damage that has been happening. He then gave the first of his many radio addresses to the nation, a fireside chat. I'm going to put a little line by here, right there. Okay, again, remember, radio was a big deal at this point. This is how you got your news. So he literally sat down and he got a transmitter and he just talked to the nation like we were sitting next to each other, right here with the president, next to a cozy fire, okay? We were just citizens talking to one another, or him talking and us listening, and it really did a lot to kind of quell this anxiety that a lot of America was facing at this point. His fireside chats, he explained the new banking policy. He eased fears. He was talking everybody through what he was doing, and trying to reassure everybody, trying to lessen the panic and the anxiety. Beginning during the 100 days and continuing until 1935, okay, 2 years now, President Roosevelt instituted the programs that comprised the first New Deal, which included the founding of these agencies. Okay, again, hitting the ground running, and over the course of 2 years, beginning during that initial 100 days till 1935, he's putting the New Deal into place. Now, I'm going to circle this right here if I can be real careful. That's not going to work. Excuse me. Called the alphabet agencies for all the acronyms. Okay, so a lot of times nowadays, if we're talking about, alphabet agencies, we think what, FBI, CIA, NSA, that kind of thing. So these are, a lot of these are predecessors to either predecessors to modern day organizations that still exist, or things that were along those lines but were necessary at this particular point in history. All right, so Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, which helped the unemployed. Today we have something for natural disasters, responses to states of emergency, stuff like that, and we call it FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Association. So this is something that hasn't gone totally away, even though I believe the job is very different. Excuse me, Agricultural Adjustment Administration, AAA, which subsidized farmers for occasionally destroying their crops. Now, why would they have to destroy their crops? Because I totally agree that, we should pay them for their loss. Like if they're being ordered to destroy their crops, we should pay them back for that. But why would they have to destroy their crops? Well, if you'll remember, that part of the illusion of wealth that led to the Great Depression, that led to all of this, part of that process was overproduction in farms and factories. So in an effort to stop that overproduction from happening again, periodically he would say, we will give you money, but instead of trying to sell this particular portion of your crop, we need you to destroy it. We need you to keep it out of circulation so that we do not have this excess, this surplus that got us in trouble the first time. We don't need to have that happen again. So this kept food supplies low and prices high. But this policy was controversial as hunger remained a problem for many people, and yet food was being thrown away. Now that's obviously a very conflicting sort of situation to be in, where if you have people going hungry, why are you throwing away or destroying perfectly good food? And it's a very, very tricky situation. I do not envy him having been in that situation. So here, let me see if I can circle this. I know this is really dark. I'm going to read this to you. Subsidy, money given by the government to help an industry or business to achieve a public goal. Okay, so instead of coming in and saying, okay, farmers, you need to destroy your crops, and then, period, full stop, that's the end of the sentence. We are not letting the government say, okay, you have to do this, so much as we're saying, the government is saying, we will pay you, we will, try and make reparations for anything you have to destroy, but we do need you to destroy some of this so that we don't get back into the same bad situation. All right, let's talk about some more of these organizations. Public Works, up here in the pink box. Public Works Administration, PWA, which sponsored public works and created jobs. So what's a public work? All right. Work like building roads, schools, infrastructure that is done by the government for the public. Okay. So again, like the dam and different things like that, These are attempts at the government creating public use areas or public use facilities, or even, I don't even want to say amenities, but things that the public could use, like roads and parks and things like that. And of course, funding schools, that this is going to benefit everybody, so the government can pay for it, to improve the quality of life for everybody, but also improve the quality of life for individuals by creating jobs, by which, these works projects will be achieved, and then hopefully stimulate the economy that way. Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, which was similar to the PWA, but focused on conservation projects. Okay, so conservation here, conservation here meaning conserving resources. Okay, so these could be natural resources. Sorry, I'm trying to write with my finger and it is going just swimmingly. Resources. And conservationism, save the trees, save the forest, forest land, save natural water resources, etc., etc., etc. Or even just conservation, making better use of the resources that we do have. All right. Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC. This one's still around today. This ensures bank deposits so people would not lose their money if banks failed. So today, if we have an economic crisis, instead of snowballing where everybody goes to pull money out of the bank, and then the bank doesn't have the money to operate, and then the bank closes, which makes other people panic. Instead of that whole spiraling snowball of bad feedback, we have actual federal insurance now that says, okay, if you deposit your money in a bank, you will, using this insurance, federal deposit insurance, you will still have access to your money. It's not as simple as the bank goes under and closes, and then you're just out however much your savings was. We actually have a plan for that now. Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, which brought electricity to the Tennessee Valley, to the Tennessee Valley through new dams and created jobs in the area. Now, how does a dam, that blocks up the water, how does that bring electricity to an area? How in the world does any of that work? Well, especially down here in the South, a lot of our power is actually hydroelectric power. Hydro, again, means water. So we can actually generate electricity from the flow of water currents, and an easy way to do that on a large scale is to put a dam across a river and be able to control the flow of water through that dam. Okay? So the Tennessee Valley Authority was able to build these new dams, which are jobs in and of themselves. And then, since they're bringing electricity, and that requires things like wiring and maintenance and things like that, we're constantly creating new jobs. So that was great for the Tennessee Valley Authority to be able to do that. National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, which set labor standards such as minimum wage and a ban on child labor. So here we have a big asterisk there. So we talked about cost of living raises. We talked about why that's important. Also, periodically, even today, we will have a minimum wage increase. And this is supposed to be part of keeping up with the cost of living. And then the ban on child labor, because again, we had people who were so desperate for any sort of income that we had children being sent to work again, or if they had felt like they were a burden, they would run away and try to find work on their own. Both of these, both of these things are terrible and destroyed families. So we were working for a plan to try and keep that from happening. Also, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, regulated the stock market, and then the SEC is actually still around today. Regulated the stock market, again, in an attempt to keep the terrible crash and the buying and selling and all of that. Again, trying to keep this from happening, from history from repeating itself, because everybody who lived through this agreed that we needed plans to prevent these things from happening again in the future. All right, so let's talk about the second New Deal. He's got the first New Deal up on its feet and running. He's going to establish all these new agencies, so let's move forward. In the 1934 midterm elections, and then during the 1936 presidential election, so let's do 36 and 34 here, the nation showed strong support for the Democratic Party and Roosevelt, who won in a landslide. Okay, again, this Roosevelt is FDR. He won in a landslide. Well, he's had some success, right? He's actually been able to turn some of these situations around. Who wouldn't vote for him at this particular point? Won in a landslide victory. Although some conservatives thought the New Deal was a socialist abuse of presidential power, again, socialism controlling not only the distribution of resources, but also the methods of production. And some liberals, notably notably Senator Huey Long of Louisiana, thought it didn't go far enough toward redistribution of wealth. Most people needed more assistance. The Depression was still in full force. So he's kind of, even though he won in a landslide as far as the actual popular vote, as far as the actual citizens preferring him being in the office, there were conservative congressmen and people around him who thought that it went too far, and there were more liberal congressmen and politicians around him that thought it didn't go far enough. So he was starting to experience, I guess we want to say, a little bit of pushback. So he's no longer this golden boy savior character. People are really starting to look at him like, well, but are you really doing enough? Or, well, are you really doing too much to push us towards socialism? And that kind of thing. Okay, so he is starting to be looked at now at the time of the second New Deal. So when the first one began to expire, when funding for things started to come up for discussion again, Roosevelt instituted a second New Deal, and it was even more than the first set of programs. Okay, these initiatives attempted to instigate true social change rather than simply help people get by. So he's no longer looking for a quick fix or a band-aid. He's trying to actually change the way our society was set up so that we could, again, avoid this manner of thing in the future. So we have now the new Works Progress Administration. WPA was much like the PWA, the Public Works Administration, but went further to employ artists and young people. Okay? Artists and young people. Now, I'm sure that you guys can understand that some people don't necessarily think of artists and young people if they think of essential workers. But he made sure to reach out specifically to these underrepresented groups. Not even underrepresented, but like under-supported groups. He wanted to make sure that they were being helped as well, helped to recover. The Revenue Act of 1935 raised taxes on the rich, and the Wagner Act made sure that labor unions had the right to fair negotiations. perhaps most importantly, the Social Security Act, August 1935. Let's see if I can. Social Security Act. Here we go. Gave birth to the modern system of welfare in America. People pay Social Security taxes throughout their working lives and in return receive payment back when they retire or if they are unable to work. So let's talk about the definition of welfare here. Welfare here just says assistance from the government, usually in the form of money. Now, let's talk about Social Security and welfare and all that kind of stuff. This has obviously been redone and expanded since 1935, when it was put into place. But the idea being that welfare is where you can apply to the government for assistance in survival, okay, and the government has a fund or has a plan or has a protocol to follow to get you that assistance. So things nowadays that would qualify as welfare, we actually have health care that is specifically subsidized by the government, again, paid for by the government, for low-income families that cannot afford any manner of private plan. We have different food relief, nutrition programs. I'm sure you guys have heard about WIC or food stamps or SNAP or EBT benefits. All of these programs are organized in such a way as to meet needs for specific demographics of people. So if you've got a young mother who is struggling to get nutritious food for her children, that there's supposed to be a plan for that. And if you have entire families who need assistance just getting any sort of food on the table at all, there's a plan for that. Now, obviously, we've talked about this before, that anytime you have any sort of assistance program, there will always be people trying to take advantage. There will always be people who just don't follow the rules, who don't think about other people, and who try and take it all for themselves. But by and large, the design for these programs is not a terrible one. And it's certainly, I personally don't mind as a taxpayer, as an adult. I personally do not mind, my taxes being used to help someone who legitimately needs help, but I do sort of get sad thinking about people who might scam the system and make it harder for those who really are in need to get the assistance that they actually require to stay alive, or to feed their children, or to get on their feet enough to get their own job, or whatever their need is. So when we talk about welfare today, we're talking about something that's a little bit different from when these things started back in 1935. Because things have had to grow and evolve and stuff like that, and you will hear about people abusing the system, but I don't want you guys to think that everybody on welfare is out to do that, and I don't want you to think that welfare is anything how to explain it, like I don't want you guys to think that if somebody needs assistance, it means they're bad or anything like that. There's a lot of stigma around it, so just keep your mind open as we continue to talk about these kinds of programs. All right, so let's talk about the Dust Bowl. Okay, now you can see on this map that this is a region that is highlighted that's kind of in the middle of the country. Okay, So, in addition to the Depression, as if that was not enough, Americans were hit with another misfortune during the 1930s. In 1931, did I get it? Oh, I marked it out. That's not what I was trying to do. 1931. A severe drought struck the Great Plains, this central area of the country here, which turned the area into a dust bowl, as in the ground was all dried out, nothing was growing in it, so anytime the wind blew, it just stirred up a whole bunch of dust. Okay, and this effect lasted more than a decade. For years before, farmers had cleared land in such a way that the natural grass lost the roots that would connect it to topsoil. So when the winds came through, the dry dirt, unanchored by grass, was swept up into dust storms. Okay, and we're not talking about like little dust devils like we see sometimes around here. No, we're talking about tremendous, devastating dust storms. Okay, farmers from Oklahoma in particular left the area to become migrant workers in California. You can see these arrows here that are labeled worker migration. I'm gonna see if I can, yeah, there you go. And so they're migrating from this area to work in California and the Pacific Northwest, to get away from the effects of the dust, because it was very, very damaging. Okay, the poverty-stricken Oklahoma natives were known as Okies. Oh, and here, this is a book here that some people read in high school and some people read in college. The Grapes of Wrath. This is actually written about this time period in history, and it paints a very dark picture. But this was a rough time. This was not an easy time to be alive and to try and make a living as a farmer, which most of the people on that particular side of the country did. All right. The Supreme Court struck down the NIRA as an unconstitutional restriction of commerce. Now, what was the NIRA? The National Industrial Recovery Act, which set labor standards such as minimum wage and set a ban on child labor. Wait a minute. How can you be upset about establishing minimum wage and banning child labor? All right. Unconstitutional restriction of commerce. So Congress responded by passing the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, in 1935. I'll underline that if I can. I sort of marked it out, but you can still see. Guaranteeing certain rights to unions. So, here, they've got a Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO. It's increasing its membership by welcoming women, minorities, and unskilled laborers. And unions began also using sit-down strikes, which were strikes that took place within the factories. They would show up, they would, be there where they were supposed to be, but they would sit down. They would not work. And this was a tremendous demonstration that they had. The Supreme Court struck down key pieces of FDR's New Deal legislation. In response, in February 1937, Roosevelt proposed adding more justices, which would ensure a liberal majority in the court. However, Democrats and Republicans in Congress opposed the so-called court packing scheme. Okay, so here, FDR was like, okay, if you want to block the stuff that I'm doing, if you want to try and undo my New Deal, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to find a way to add more justices to the Supreme Court that are liable to agree with me and therefore tip the balance of power back in my favor. And thankfully, in Congress, both Democrats and Republicans alike were like, yeah, that's a terrible idea. We're not going to let you manipulate the system like that, Mr. President, sir. Okay? So, unions, ups and downs. When people are worried about their jobs, there's a low demand for labor, or there's not very many job opportunities available. Okay, they are extra motivated. They are more motivated to protect themselves with unions, but they also don't want to make waves. That makes sense, right? If you're really, really, really concerned about being able to keep your job, you really don't want to take very many risks. You want to just keep your head down. You want to do everything right. You want to make sure that you are able to keep that job. But at the same time, they want some backup as well. They don't want to feel alone in their struggles. So they were interested in the unions, but they did not want to be part of something that was just going to cause trouble or add more stress to their life. On the other hand, when more workers are needed, high demand for labor, more jobs being open, people have less of a need for a union, but the unions feel more free to make demands. Okay, so there's less. People don't necessarily feel like they need that same backup, but if you're in a union, as opposed to, okay, keep your head down, don't make waves, they might be like, hey, now might be a great time to talk about a cost of living raise, or now might be a time to talk about better hours or better shift work, something like that. Okay, they get kind of comfortable and they start rocking the boat a little bit. All right. Another aspect of Roosevelt's presidency was his stance on civil rights. It was a big deal that he was so pro civil rights and inclusion and stuff like that, okay? Because especially during the 1936 presidential elections, many African Americans switched over to the Democratic Party because of his policies, okay? I'm going to put a star right here because it says it was the first time as a demographic group that they stepped away from the party of Lincoln. Again, historically to this point, African Americans had been Republican to support, Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. They followed the Republicans up until this point because of that history that they had. And the party of Lincoln is referring to the Republican Party at that point, from which the current Republican Party has actually developed. Roosevelt also relied on his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, which was kind of a big deal, right? Actually, using her as an advisor and a, quote, black cabinet to advise him on matters affecting the black population. So he did not try to assume that he knew what was actually going on and what was affecting the African American population of the United States. He actually went to people more knowledgeable than he and said, what are the problems? How do we fix it? Okay? But at the same time, Eleanor rose to prominence in national life and became a sign of the advancement of women's rights. FDR appointed the first female cabinet member, Frances Perkins, as Secretary of Labor. Okay? Again, super open-minded compared to some of the people in the past. I'm not sure. Hopefully you can see this blue right here. It's a little hard to read on my picture, but I think it's a little brighter for you guys. Eleanor Roosevelt, and I think this is supposed to be a sketch of her? Question mark? Eleanor Roosevelt was a controversial first lady and an American politician, diplomat, and activist in her own right. Okay? So, not only was she controversial as a first lady, as in wife of the president, but on her own merits, she was sort of controversial. She sort of rocked the boat as a politician, as a diplomat, and as an activist, separate from just being the wife of a president. She was outspoken and active in fighting for the rights of women. Try and underline all of this. Oh no, don't mark it out. Women, African and Asian Americans, and war refugees. Okay? So traditionally marginalized groups, she sought them out and she was like, no, we are going to treat these people like people. She famously arranged a concert by the black singer Marian Anderson at the Lincoln Memorial after the Daughters of the American Revolution banned her from singing at Constitution Hall. So they found out, she found out that the Daughters of the American Revolution, or the DAR, had banned her from singing at Constitution Hall, and she said, oh no, we will not allow that to happen, and she rearranged the performance so that it could still happen, and in an arguably even more public place. The Lincoln Memorial is very, very open and visible. So if the DAR was hoping to kind of hide her away, they failed miserably thanks to Miss Eleanor Roosevelt. Escapism. Now, this is something you guys are familiar with, I'm sure. Escapism. Although some art that emerged during the Great Depression took a serious look at American life, like The Grapes of Wrath and Woody Guthrie's folk music. These are very serious, dark pictures of life in the time. The 1930s were also the height of escapism. People watched movies now that they were the talkies. People watched movies as a distraction. People were able to actually, scrounge together enough for a movie ticket periodically, and they said, hey, let's go think about something else for a while and stuff. And I know that we even still do that today. Like, okay, I need to decompress, long day at school, long day of homework, something like that. And so I just want to unwind, and I'm going to play games for a while, or I'm going to scroll YouTube on my phone, or whatever. We have that same concept even today. But they listen to music, they listen to the radio programs, like I said, the radio dramas. They were able to get to the movies. Soap operas were happening on the radio dramas. So if you think about the soap operas that are on TV nowadays, but just think about them as coming through the radio instead. So you had all of the intrigue of who was dating who and all of this sort of thing, all of that drama just coming through the radio. Radio dramas about like murder mysteries or superheroes or sleuths trying to figure out mysteries. Big band music, swing music, dancing actually was really huge once big band and swing really started to increase in popularity. Movies such as The Wizard of Oz, King Kong, and Gone with the Wind helped many Americans make it through the decade. And here we have a definition of escapism: escaping from daily life, usually through entertainment. So like a distraction. Okay, and you can see my little King Kong here. How was your day? Hard, the poor little plane says. So King Kong there, that idea of this tremendous primate climbing the tower and all the havoc and stuff like that, that was a huge distraction. It was this fantasy that got people kind of out of the stress of their everyday lives, even if it was just for a little bit. And a lot of people sought that out because of just how stressful things were during this time. So now, the end of the Depression. In 1937, let's see if I can underline that. Whoop, almost. 1937. Yeah, there we go. It seemed as though the New Deal was working. Okay, so Roosevelt has these plans, he has these programs, he has all these long-term goals, and it seems like it's really working. And Roosevelt decided that it was time to cut the deficit, which had grown during the Depression. However, deficit here, the amount by which more money is spent than is coming in. We've talked about this in math class before as well. Like if you only make $200 a week, it doesn't make good sense for you to spend $350 a week in bills. That's not, you're not living somewhere that's sustainable. So he said, okay, as a country, we are dealing with this deficit, and we need to cut back on it. You know, we need to figure out a way to get rid of some of this debt, some of this deficit. It says, however, to do so, he needed to decrease spending on recovery programs. So these programs that he had set up in order to support people as they recovered from the stock market crash, from the Great Depression, all of these recovery programs that were aimed on getting individuals and also the country back on its feet, he had to cut spending there. And when he did this, he miscalculated the stability of the economy. Okay? So he cut it off a little before the economy was really ready. Roosevelt's decision to decrease spending, okay, so to try and cut the deficit by decreased spending on these programs, combined with the tight credit, led to another dip in the nation's economy, now known as the Roosevelt recession. Okay, full recovery did not occur, and that's for the country, until World War II began. Most of the New Deal programs expired or were canceled as the economy improved, right? Because that makes sense. We don't need so many recovery programs if people are already getting back on their feet. But some of them, such as Social Security, the FDIC, and the SEC, remain central aspects of the relationship between American citizens and the federal government. All right, so that is the end of the Great Depression. Again, as I've said before, if you'll notice here, I have 7 questions. So if you will please wait for this video to load fully on YouTube to be able to watch the whole thing before answering that questions, it will greatly behoove you to do so. And yeah, please don't try to just Google these, because I don't want things getting confused. So again, if you will subscribe to my YouTube, you will get a notification when my videos go live on my channel, and that way you will not have to sit there waiting and refreshing the page. You can subscribe and sign up to get notifications. All right, so that's it for the Great Depression, and I will see you later. I hope you have a great and wonderful day.